I now have the great pleasure of introducing our second speaker, Professor Sonja van Wichelen. Sonja is Professor of Anthropology and Sociology in the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Sydney. Her research explores the intersections of law, life, and science in a globalizing world. Her most recent book, co-authored with Marc Delou, is Biolegality, A Critical Introduction, published in 2024. And Sonja serves on the editorial committee of the Annual Review of Anthropology and the editorial boards of Science, Technology, and Human Values, the Sociological Review, and Catalyst, Feminism, Theory, Technoscience. Sonja, the floor is yours.
All right. Hi. Thank you, team, for organizing this amazing event. And I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Baramadigal and would like to pay respect to their elders, past and present. So, where to begin when asked to talk about what is theory? And to do it only in 50 minutes. So I apologize in advance for reading from my text. There's a lot to say, and reading helps me to stay within the time I've been given. So I actually teach theory. I'm, as Sophie said, Professor of Anthropology and Sociology at the University of Sydney, and I'm the designated theory person in the department. I teach sociological theory, social legal theory, and theory-heavy electives, including nature and society. As you can imagine, there's much ground to cover when one teaches theory, but let me start, like Brett, by looking at the title of the symposium, What is Theory? An ontological question. And knowing the organizers and the kind of anthropology they practice, I'm quite sure they are not expecting us to explain the whatness of theory, let alone spell out definitive fact, truth, or being of what theory is. The organizers didn't choose titles like what is good theory or what is theory for? Those questions raised by Juan in his introductory remarks. Normative and teleological questions. Instead, we were invited to show you how we understand, use, and develop theory in our own scholarly work. Now, I'd like to contribute to this conversation by discussing three things. I'm hoping this works, yeah. About the place of theory in my writing, which, for the sake of entertainment, I have conflated with titles of cultural artifacts. The unbearable lightness of theory, theory, everything, everywhere, all at once, and brave new theory. So let's start with the first one. When undergraduate students first encounter theory, they think they hate theory. Theory is difficult, it's too abstract, and they can't see its usefulness. So let me get back to this idea of usefulness later on. Graduate students, their engagement with theory roughly fall into two categories. Those who are anxious about theory and those who get off on theory. My colleague Kane Race aptly describes the latter as those masturbating their head off on theory. While this often involves young men, women's heads are blowing off too. I'm being provocative here, of course, which, by the way, was another prompt by the organizers. And I'm Dutch, it goes with my national identity. But doing theory in many places has become synonymous with disciplinary status, showing off theory, a sign of sophistication. There's a gender dimension there. Theory for theory's sake has often been seen as belonging to the realm of men. And this is more so in STEM, where graduate students were told not too long ago that men do theory, women do experiments. And there's a reason why I begin with this observation. To avoid the halo of theory that numbs students and scholars into either anxiety or orgasm, we need to deflate theory. One way of deflating theory is to study the meaning of theory. So the sociologist Gabriel Abend writes about how this semantic question allows us to see that theorists talk about different things when invoking theory. So Abend sets out 7 different ways sociologists do theory, and I won't go through them all, but they go from general propositions between variables to explaining particular phenomena, to studying canonical authors like Marx and Weber, to examining worldviews like feminist or post-colonial theory. When I look at my own work and the books that I published, my work can be categorized as falling into 3 of these meanings of theory. My first book explained Islamic reconfiguration in post-Soeharto Indonesia, which would belong to what Abend described as theory 2. My second book examined international adoption practices through feminist and post-colonial lenses, exploring how children's bodies become commodified globally, attending to theory 5 and 7. And my recent co-authored book, Biolegality, examines how biotechnology challenges legal categories like property and personhood. It is theory 7 all the way, if you apply Abend's categorizations. But this is all to illustrate that if we articulate what we mean by the theory we're doing, theory deflates. It is dethroned from its precious aura, and theory becomes lighter. Maybe to the chagrin of some, hence the unbearableness of it, but the lightness, I would argue, democratizes theory. Now, moving on to my second point. So what I'm about to say now might delegitimize the neat ordering of different meanings of theory set out by Abend. What Abend missed in his account was an engagement with method when theorizing about the place of theory. I'm sure when the organizers had their event around methods last year, they encountered the argument that methods cannot be separated from theory. In my subfield, Science and Technology Studies, or STS, we talk about the theory methods package, where the conceptual and the empirical are kept close. For instance, actor network theory can be understood as a meta-theoretical orientation that brings together the ontological and the methodological. It assumes that reality is not fixed, but continually enacted through the assembling, disassembling, and reassembling of heterogeneous actant associates. Empirical inquiry, in turn, traces these assemblages as they take shape while also generating new, partly unpredictable ontologies. Ethnographic skill and imagination are pivotal to the inquiry's post. Now, it's relevant to note that the theory methods package did not just emerge in STS. My partner reminded me that in hermeneutics, this was the case all along. In Truth and Method, Gadamer deploys the concept of philosophical hermeneutics, describing interpretation as grounded in historically affected consciousness, where meaning emerges through a fusion of horizons between text and interpreter. Like STS approaches, his aim was not to prescribe a method, but to show how knowledge is always enacted in practice, whether we recognize it or not. But if theory is method, and reality is not fixed, but continually enacted, where do we start when everything is everywhere all at once? And here, for the sake of entertainment, is where I would have brought in some props, but through all kinds of situations, I wasn't able to do that. But I have an image. I was going to bring in a material transfer agreement, a copy of a material transfer agreement. And I was going to ask my son to make some fake poo and put it in a bag and just place them in front of us. But here we go. We'll just keep to our visuals. So 2 objects, a material transfer agreement, or MTA, and a stool sample. To analyze everything everywhere all at once, we need to start with the objects we study and theorize how these objects have been enacted. As this first session is entitled Law, Institutions, and Society, I wanted to bring in objects that, when theorized through the theory methods package, unravel something about the entanglement of law, institutions, and society. So my first prop is a material transfer agreement, or MTA, and it figures in my current research around bioscience governance and global inequality. An MTA is a contract between a provider of tangible research material and the recipient. And if we're talking about biological material, these could be cells or reagents. Providers and recipients can be public or private institutions, so universities or pharmaceutical companies. I follow the MTA from its origins in the US, where it has been theorized as a central symptom of the privatization of science, to its uses in Indonesia, where MTAs are differently enacted. Using a post-colonial science studies lens, I show how post-colonial states use such legal devices to gain more leverage in the uneven space of global scientific exchange and collaboration. Approaching the MTA as an object of study allowed me to theorize its translations and appropriations in different contexts. So my second prop, the stool samples, I analyze as they are circulating as research material. Here I was interested in processes of datafication, especially in contemporary bioscience. And especially so when considering bioinformation from the global south. Using research on the human microbiome as a case where data is extracted from human stool samples, I demonstrate the thickening of data by the epistemic infrastructure through which scientists interpret microbiomic data, and the challenges microbiomics bring to law and regulatory capitalism. The theory methods package brought stool samples to speak to theories of law and valuation, to reflect critically on the global governance of scientific exchange in the era of digital biology. But more generally, the theory methods package invites us to be analogic, and therefore in more than one place at a time, and to allow many interests to be held up together. Analogy offers a way out of the narrow logic that treats cause and effect as the only meaningful relation. This logic wrongly assumes that if no direct connection exists, one thing cannot matter to another, foreclosing the possibility of finding new links. Now, before my time is up, I want to move on to my last point. So for my last point, I want to return to my remark earlier, namely that undergraduates think theory is useless. This perception is not surprising when we factor in how the usefulness of research is mandated into our everyday academic life. The practice of theorizing for theory's sake is regarded by our institutions as futile, wasteful, and even morally abhorrent, especially when framed against the state of the world. Now, one of my favorite theorists, Marin Strathern, has written on this problem in a really fascinating way. Strathern approaches theory as a body of knowledge. To theorize in this respect is to develop this body of knowledge. And now there's talk that anthropological knowledge is not useful enough. While anthropology may have helped articulate problems in culture, medicine, and law, critics argue it has not provided realistic solutions. Rather than dismissing this thought, Strathern theorizes this claim, acknowledging that there's a core to anthropology that appears useless. In her article, Useful Knowledge, she suggests, and I quote, that there might be something to be gained from acknowledging uselessness, even if it's not on the agenda of today's world of knowledge producers and knowledge managers. The student thinking theory is useless is thinking much in the way the contemporary university wants them to think. That knowledge should be purposeful and strategic. Even the ARC Discovery grants, claiming to value blue sky thinking, come with national interest tests to test the proposal's usefulness for the Australian state. Strathern describes this as allowing curiosity only as an add-on. The erosion of knowledge for its own sake is epitomized by our university's business model that relies on overseas students on the one hand and their successful completions on the other to maintain this model. And seen within this model, generative AI, the problem we're all facing now with, is almost a blessing in disguise. As Strathern argued with respect to an earlier form of plagiarism, and I quote, "It makes no sense to cheat when you want to improve your grasp of things, or in other words, if you want to theorize. The situation is different when the goal is the great at the end. Here, knowledge manifests itself as material to be managed. Generative AI as a form of plagiarism on steroids seems like an ultimate refinement of knowledge management, plagiarizing not from a single author, but from an infinite combination of authors worldwide." So theorizing is the epitome of learning. This does not mean, though, that we go back to self-congratulatory theorizing, and I won't use Kane Ray's description anymore. Rather, I'm suggesting we approach theorizing for theory's sake as an ethos. Like Brad mentioned, theory is not what you do alone. It's what you do with others. It's what you do with the community, like what we're doing right here. An ethos pertinent to the times in which we live. With scientific institutions fracturing and our universities acting as corporations, theorizing and producing knowledge for its own sake seems more of a responsibility rather than a privilege. This is not without consequence. When I teach sociological theory, I remind students that theory can be dangerous. And Juan alluded to this too. Durkheim, himself a Jew, developed sociology amid rising anti-Semitism in the late 19th century France, showing theory is never neutral. Like Huxley's Brave New World, which shows how the promise of rational progress can turn into machinery of domination, doing brave new theory also carries dangers because ideas never circulate in neutral spaces. We're back in dark times, and again, not only in the US. Indeed, the darkness seeped in long before we found words to describe it, shaping our institutions. The US-Russian journalist Masha Gessen argues that anticipatory obedience is a key building block of this power and describes how universities have adjusted their programming in hopes of conforming with expectations that have not yet been clearly laid out. At my university too, what we can teach becomes increasingly controlled. Theorizing then is not about offering ready-made solutions, nor about escaping the world's urgencies. It is about insisting that knowledge remains open, risky, and alive, even when institutions would rather manage, contain, or silence it. Thanks for listening.